Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out today to hear what I hope will be some inspiring messages and some challenging messages as well. We're going to start this morning with two presentations that look at population trends. I'll do the first, really focusing on El Paso, and then Tracy Ayrhart from Texas 2036 will come up and talk about statewide trends and what we're seeing. A couple of notes before we really start diving into numbers. One, we're going to talk about population growth, population stagnation, population decline. Population growth and population decline in and of themselves are not good or bad things, right? There are positives and negatives that come whatever direction we have. But I think it's important to understand where we are and where we may be going so that we can make some of these decisions. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about trends. Trends show us where we've been. They can give some hint of where we're going, but they are not prescriptive of our future because we all have agency to change things and to transform the direction where we're going. One of the things that you're going to notice from the panelists as they come up is we've kind of carefully curated the panelists to have a lot of people who have been transformative, who have changed the course of things. So we're not captive to that history of these population trends. But we need to understand that the trends we're on, because if we don't, we can't really plan. And I do think one of the concerns that I hear a lot is that El Paso gets really siloed. And local governments are making decisions without consulting with schools, and they're not consulting with businesses, and businesses are surprised to hear that something's going to happen over here. So hopefully this conversation today can be a spark plug to really try to drive some of these conversations across disciplines so that we're not always surprising each other. So I'm going to run through some numbers, and I'm probably going to go through this real quickly, so I apologize for that. But this is just really to frame these conversations. So I first want to start by looking at the journey that we've been on. And this first chart looks at population changes by decade in terms of percentage growth. And other than in the 1930s, it's always been growth, right? We kind of are familiar with El Paso's history. We're a dusty frontier town. The railroads arrive in 1881. A lot of people start coming in as a result of that. Population starts to grow. In 1910, the Mexican Revolution happens, which begins to drive a lot more people from Mexico across the border. So we see population growth in the 1910s and 1920s. And the 1920s is where I pick up this slide. So in the 1920s, largely as a result of immigration driven by the Mexican Revolution, we see this 29% growth. 1930s, we have some severe disruption. We have a Great Depression that comes in. One of the U.S. responses that has kind of been lost to history to the Great Depression is we began a mass deportation campaign on the southwest border, including deportation of many citizens because of this concern that we're in this economic crisis and we want to preserve as many jobs as we can for what we're viewed as Americans. So we have this lost decade in the 30s. Then in the 1940s, World War II reshapes the globe. El Paso begins to grow rapidly. Two drivers of that. One is the expansion of Fort Bliss and the increasing role of national defense in a Cold War environment that builds up. And then we really begin to see very rapid immigration from Mexico begin to flow into the United States in the 40s and 50s. And El Paso is literally the gateway to the United States. So we began to take in much of the Mexican immigration influx into this country. El Paso is the first stop. if I meet a third or fourth generation Mexican American, I can tell them, I bet your grandparents or great grandparents came through El Paso, and it's almost always true. You hear the phrase Ellis Island of the Southwest. That's not an exaggeration. This is where we come in. In the 1950s, that growth really accelerates, largely because El Paso begins to pivot to being a manufacturing hub, garment, other types of manufacturing. These manufacturing facilities that pop up in El Paso offer wages that are immensely attractive to people in Mexico because they're multiples higher than what they could earn in their own country. Mexico is experiencing rapid population growth without the economic growth to match. The average woman in Mexico in her lifetime at this point is having 6 children. By the way, today that's really close to 1. Mexico's birth rate, this will surprise a lot of people, is lower than the United States birth rate. And that becomes important as the decades pass. So we begin to attract all of these immigrants from Mexico to work in these manufacturing facilities. We do an outstanding job in El Paso of offering economic mobility to immigrants from Mexico. What we're never quite able to do is to match that by offering economic mobility to their children and grandchildren. And I'll show you how that plays out in a second. Growth really slows in the 1960s, mainly because the immigration wave begins to subside, in large part because of very restrictive US immigration laws. But in 1965, Congress passes and President Johnson signs a bill called the Immigration and Nationalities Act, which overhauls the American immigration system and starts to favor things like family reunification. And so that jump starts immigration from Mexico again. So you see in the 1970s, we have this really big run up in immigration into El Paso that drives our population growth. So 2 things are happening that are very much related. We have immigrants coming in, and those immigrants are having children. So we have a lot of natural population growth and immigration growth. But as you can see, that really starts to fade over time. In large part, that's because Mexico's economy starts improving. The birth rate declines, so there's a lot less pressure on people to migrate. And also, other communities in the United States are now competing for immigrants as well. So not as many of them are staying in El Paso. Sylvia from Chicago mentions a great example of that, right? Her mother gets married and they move to Chicago because there are economic opportunities in Chicago as well. But we still continue to have growth over the decades, but you can really see it start to slow in the 2010s, and now in the 2020s, it's virtually stopped. Through the first half of this decade, we've only had about a 1.4% population increase. I think by the end of the decade, we'll probably be close to flat or down a little bit. So that's the journey we've been on. So there are 3 things that drive population change. One is natural change, which is the difference between births and deaths. 2 is immigration from foreign countries, in our case primarily Mexico. And 3 is what's called domestic migration, which is the movement between US communities. So I wanted to show you, so we talked about, like from the 50s on, we had great immigration from Mexico that drove things. By the 90s, that starts to really wind down. And so you can see from 2010 forward, we have this very uneven picture of what's happening on the immigration front. Whereas decades ago, we might have had 8,000 or 10,000 immigrants coming in. Now, in good years, 2,000, 3,000. And then in 2017, you see this big change. So instead of thousands, we have hundreds. Anybody remember what happened in 2017? Donald Trump becomes president, right? And we take this new approach to immigration in the country. So you can see that through Trump's first term and then into the pandemic, immigration largely stops. And then you see this really big spike between 2022 and 2024, which is sort of where we really lost control of border enforcement. These are mostly what would turn out to be temporary residents here, but they happen to be present on July 1st of each year, which is when these population estimates come out. And then 2025, boom, back down to 300. Anybody remember what happened in 2025? Trump becomes president again. So we have these wild swings in immigration in the last decade that are driven largely by political decisions that the American public is making. So let's look at net domestic migration. Notice how all of these numbers are negative, with the one exception being in 2011, which is when the base realignment and closure process is drawing to an end. The Army has decided to move the 1st Armored Division to Fort Bliss. The Fort Bliss soldier population jumps from about 12,000 to 30,000, and that's pretty much built out by 2011. That's essentially where El Paso's population growth stops. And so we see these net migration numbers really decline. I want you to just keep it in the back of your head, these numbers between 2013 and 2015, where we see a net population loss of more than 30,000 people. Realize that migration is something that's done by young people primarily. So these are mostly people in their 20s and 30s that are leaving. The reason they're leaving in 2013 is the US is finally coming out of the Great Recession. Economic opportunities are popping up in the rest of the country, and so people are leaving. And you can see that kind of settles down over the succeeding years, but we always have pretty steep population declines, cut a little break during the pandemic because the economy is largely shut down and there's nowhere for people to move. Why is that happening? This, I would suggest, is the one thing I want you to take home thinking a lot about. This is the private sector wage in El Paso as a percentage of state and national averages. The average private sector wage right now in El Paso is a little over $900 a week. Nationally and statewide, it's closer to $1,600. So at the beginning of this century, El Paso's average private sector wage was about 2/3 of the state and national average. Not a great place to start, but then it gets worse. So even as we've made some really positive investments in things like healthcare through the Medical Center of the Americas, which has brought some income growth in those sectors, as an economy as a whole, we are losing ground to the rest of the country when it comes to average private sector wages. What does that do? It winds up driving young people out of El Paso because they need to go find work somewhere else. One of the other things you often hear about El Paso is we have a low cost of living, and sometimes that's used to justify the low salaries. I will tell you that to me, affordability is a function of income as much as it is a function of the cost of goods. And so I ran this calculation earlier this year. The Economic Policy Institute has a standard that they call a modest but adequate lifestyle. It basically allows a family to live without government support and without being wiped out because their car breaks down. So these aren't rich people, but they're adequate and comfortable. So I looked at a family of four, a couple and two children, and these other counties up here with El Paso County aren't chosen at random. These other counties are what IRS data tells me is where our people are moving to seek better opportunities. So you can see that in El Paso, you have to have about 192% of the average private sector wage to meet this standard. So basically, both members of the couple have to be earning $900 and something a week, which is hard to do, especially if one of the parents can only work part-time to help take care of the kids. We don't compare well to any of these other cities except Doña Ana County, which is like you have to earn 2.5 times as a couple the average private sector wage in Doña Ana County, which, by the way, is why somebody living in Doña Ana County is 3.5 times more likely to move to El Paso than the other way around. You hear a lot about people leaving El Paso to go to Doña Ana County because of property taxes. That probably happens anecdotally, but more people or a higher percentage of Doña Ana's population is heading this way because El Paso is more affordable for them in terms of income. All of these other communities where people are going to, they offer significantly higher wages, so even though cost of housing might be more expensive, it is literally more affordable for them. So this graphic tells us that from an affordability standpoint, El Paso is not competitive with the communities that are drawing our people. So natural population change is this third category that I talked about. So we've talked about immigration, domestic migration, and now we have natural population change, which combined with immigration is what's been driving our population growth. You can see it's going down. It really dropped in 2021 during the pandemic because, as you all know, El Paso was hit much harder than other communities by the pandemic. But even after coming out of the pandemic, our natural population growth is half of what it was just 15 years ago. And that will continue to go down. And I'll show you in a second. Again, this is a mathematical calculation. It is not a prediction of the future. But I want to show you, this is the birth rate before I get to that. So El Paso's number of births peaks in 1993 and then began a slow decline. That's an important number because remember when we talked about the net migration problem in 2013 to 2015? The people born in the late 80s and early 90s now are at that point were hitting their early 20s to mid 20s. And they're leaving because we didn't have economic opportunity for them. Then the birth rate starts to decline, so in the following years we didn't have as much outward migration, not because El Paso became more attractive, we had fewer and fewer young people that we could export. So in 2015, that slow decline in population or in birth rate change really accelerates. That is a factor of all of those young people from 2013 to 2015 leaving. So they're having kids, they're not having them in El Paso. So you'll hear in the news all the time that birth rate's declining nationally, which is true, much of it for very good reasons. But El Paso's birth rate since 2015 has been declining at twice the rate of the national average, despite us being a community that's younger than the national average, which normally would predict a higher birth rate than we're seeing. There's a corresponding chart I'm not going to show you on the number of deaths because that's depressing and I don't want to look at it. But we're an aging population, right? I am, you may have noticed, aging myself. It creates this problem then where the formula we've used all the time, births minus deaths, gives you population change. It's been great, 8,000, 9,000 people a year for a while, down to 4,000 people now. But here's that aging thing. Notice that in the last decade, our population of children, meaning everybody 17 and under, has declined by 24,000. We have some modest growth among working age people, but really rapid growth in the over 65 population. Our population over 65 has increased at 11 times the rate of the rest of the population. That presents challenges. It also presents some opportunities for business people out there to think about too. So when you look at birth rates and the aging population, this is what happens to the natural growth projection. Populations don't change in straight lines, so don't take these numbers literally. This is just the trend that we're seeing. So based on the birth rates and death rates over the past decade, if we project it out, by 2023, El Paso will have more people dying than being born every year. So we already know we have domestic migration loss. We're going to start having loss in natural population, which puts us incredibly reliant on immigration as our primary means to grow workforce and other things, but we know from recent history that immigration is really unstable and subject to so much out of our control. So that's the quick tour. We're going to hear now from a lot of people who will be able to talk about some of the things that are going on in El Paso and some of the things that we could be thinking of. But before we get to that, I want to have Tracy Ayrhart come up and kind of give us a context in Texas so that we can kind of compare where El Paso is and see how we fit into the big state picture.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, all Paso Matters. This is such an exciting event. And as I was looking at what we were going to talk about today, I'm like, okay, you've got a group of people who are looking at data together and figuring out how to partner across sectors. I mean, this is my jam. You are my people. So thank you so much for having me. I think it's very similar to what Bob laid out for El Paso. I'm going to be talking a little bit about what's happening in the state of Texas as a whole. And so really, before I even dive into the specifics, there's really three things I would want you to walk away from with my presentation. One is that Texas as a whole, the population is growing, but that growth is slowing down drastically, and the reason is very specific, and I think Bob did a great job laying that out in his presentation. Second thing is that Texas is aging faster than people assume, and that has a lot of implications on how we plan ahead. And the third thing is that even though Texas as a state is growing, growth is not happening evenly across the state. And we know here in El Paso, that's not the case. And so thinking through where growth is happening and where it isn't has also implications in how we plan. But before I dive into the data, just really quick about Texas 2036. For those of you who are not familiar with Texas 2036, we are a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit public policy organization. We're headquartered in Austin, but we do have staff across the state, and we work across the state. Our name 2036 comes from the fact that that is the year Texas turns 200. So that's the horizon we're thinking of how do we set up our state in its third century to become the best place for people to live, work, and raise a family. And we do that by working across the entire policy pipeline, really starting with credible data and research, all the way to impact and implementation, working in the areas of education and workforce, economic foundations, including healthcare and childcare, infrastructure, natural resources, as well as government performance and justice. And so one of the things that I have to do at Texas 2036 as the head of data and research is really be paying attention to the data trends that help us think ahead and plan. And population and demographics is the bellwether of what's to come. And I love how Bob framed it as, you know, this isn't prescriptive, but we have to know what's going on to know how to respond. All right, so diving into the data, in terms of statewide population trends, Texas is the fastest growing large state in the US. Just looking at the numeric population growth, we lead the nation with Florida in a distant second. You've probably heard the stats that since 2020, we've added 2.5 million people to our state. We have over 31 million people today in Texas. Newer stats, though, according to the latest census data, we've been seeing over about 1,072 Texans, new Texans per day join our state. Now that is a large number because it's a very large daily growth rate, but you gotta compare that from the year before where it was 1,500. And so that is a pretty drastic decline. We're looking at about a third decrease in new people joining Texas, and that is largely driven by slower international migration. And so I'm not going to go into the components of population growth and change because Bob did that so well, but I do want to show you Texas trends as a whole. So as a whole in Texas, natural increase hasn't changed that much over the years. It's pretty stable. So if you look at the other the colors of the bar graphs, it's really domestic and international migration that's shifted over the last 5 years. And in fact, if you look at the last 2 years of data, it's international migration that has driven the change. In 2024, international migration was responsible for 60% of the population growth, 59, so about 60%. So that's 6 in 10 Texans. But last year, it dropped to under 45%. So that is very mirroring the national trends. I think in terms of the US during the same years, international migration dropped by 54%. But the numbers are still high. So we are still seeing about 170,000 people coming in from other countries. And that places us as number 2, just behind Florida. Shifting to age, Texas is younger than the US as a whole. So I believe in the US, I think 14.8% of the population is 65 or older. In Texas, that is 18.9%. No, it's the flipped. 14.9% in Texas is 65 or older, 18.9 in the US. So we are a younger population, but we are aging at the same rate as the US. And in fact, our friends from the Texas Demographic Center projected out the change in median age based on our population change, and they are projecting that Texas's median age will rise from 36 in 2020 to 44 by 2060. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the aging population trends in later slides. Shifting to where growth is landing in Texas, you hear a lot again about how Texas is growing, but growth is not happening evenly across the state. So currently about 87% of Texans live east of I-35, which means 1 in 8 Texans, including those of us in this room, don't live in that area. We live west of the I-35 corridor. And growth is concentrated in the Texas Triangle, so that's the Dallas-Fort Worth, Houston, Austin, San Antonio area. But as you can see, growth is no longer happening in the large cities. It's happening in the metro edges, in the suburbs, in the counties that are surrounding the big cities. And in fact, even though we are experiencing a period of extended growth, 82 out of the 254 counties in our state are experiencing population decline. And so that's about a third of the state that is not experiencing that growth. And so I'm just going to pivot a little bit to the economy. You're going to hear more about this in the later sessions. But if I just put jobs next to housing prices, on the left you see a graph that shows job growth in Texas versus the US. And you can see Texas was able to recover faster from the pandemic, and then it kept going in terms of bringing in new jobs. And in fact, from 2015 to 2025, Texas experienced a 20% growth in jobs, while the US only experienced 12%. But on the flip side, we're experiencing a lot of affordability issues. So median home values is just one indicator that I looked at. But what I have here are the 10 highest income metro areas in Texas. And you can see, and this is inflation adjusted, so this is based on 2024 consumer price index. But if you compare housing prices from 2014 to 2024, you can see that prices are increasing much faster than jobs are growing and income is growing, which I believe is 11% in the same time. So Austin's the outlier. I think the median home cost $265,000 in 2014, and today it is $460,000. The other areas have similar trends. Even the small metro areas are experiencing 40 to 70% in housing cost increases. So just a few things about looking ahead, and a lot of this is from, again, our friends at the Texas Demographic Center. Texas is expected to keep growing significantly, so they are modeling out different scenarios based on migration, but we are expecting that by 2060, we will have 42.6 million people in the state, up from 31 million. And the composition is shifting. On the right, you'll see that Texas Hispanic population accounts for the majority of that projected growth. But in the left, you break it down by population age. And so one of the things to note is that children, the share of children will be decreasing from 2020 to 2060, from 25% of the population to 18%. And at the same time, the share of population who is 65 and up will be increasing. And I believe that is from 13% of the population to 22%. And in fact, one of the things we talk about is an ultra-aged population, or super-aged is something else I've heard. Heard that term before. And so what that means is an area is super-aged or ultra-aged when 21% or up of the population is age 65 or older. So currently, 150 counties in Texas are ultra-aged, and they're mainly concentrated in the rural area. But if you follow the population trends, by 2060, we're estimating that 247 counties in Texas will be ultra-aged or super-aged. And that makes Texas as a whole an ultra-aged state. And that has major implication when you think about a smaller child population versus an older adult population on the K through 12 pipeline, on our labor force, on healthcare, on infrastructure needs. So there's a lot of implications of this shift in our population. So Steve Murdoch, our first demographer in Texas, has said for a long time, as Texas goes, so goes the nation. And I would add to that as parts of Texas go, so goes Texas. And one of those areas is El Paso. And so we have to be paying attention to what is happening, what we need to do to really pave the way for the rest of the state. So really appreciate the time. On here I have our website, texas2036.org. You can find reports, data, resources we've put up there. And thank you so much, Bob. Thank you so much to El Paso Matter, and thank you all for having me here today.